Most men spend years in relationships reacting to dynamics they can't quite name. They feel manipulated, they feel drained, but they can't point to the exact moment they handed over the keys to their peace of mind. And that's precisely how the game works. Her power doesn't lie in brute force or obvious demands. It lies in subtle emotional influence, in unspoken expectations, in reactions she can trigger without ever lifting a finger. But here's the truth: that power only works if you don't see the game being played. The moment you do, it collapses. You see, when a man lacks awareness, he operates in a state of confusion. He's trying to please, to understand, to make things right, but he's doing so on shifting sand. One moment she's warm and affectionate, the next she's distant. One day your effort is praised, the next day it's ignored, and so you scramble to decode her mood, to adjust your behavior, to fix what isn't yours to fix. You become reactive, and in that reactive state, you give up your masculine center. You become an actor in her play instead of the author of your own script. But the moment you wake up to the patterns, the tests, the coldness, the sudden warmth followed by withdrawal, it's like seeing behind the curtain of a magic trick. It's not that she's evil or even conscious of what she's doing. Many women don't realize how much of their identity is rooted in emotional control. What matters is that you become conscious of it, that you stop rewarding manipulation with more effort, that you stop confusing emotional turbulence with depth. Because here's what happens when you become aware: you stop reacting. You don't chase after breadcrumbs of affection. You don't internalize her silence as your failure. You don't start negotiating with yourself, watering down your boundaries just to keep her calm. You observe, you pause, you respond from a place of grounded clarity, and that changes everything. Women aren't used to men who don't flinch at emotional pressure. They're used to men who bend, who panic, who over-explain, who try to fix what's not broken in them. But the man who sees, who really sees the emotional game for what it is, isn't moved by it, not because he's cold, but because he's rooted, and that rooting forces the entire dynamic to shift. She can no longer rely on drama to extract attention. She can't use withdrawal to spark your insecurity. The tools simply stop working, and that's when something interesting happens. She either escalates the tactics, or she elevates herself. She either intensifies the emotional chaos in an attempt to regain control, or she realizes the game is over and chooses to meet you in truth. But make no mistake, that choice isn't yours to make for her. Your job is to see. Your job is to know when a woman's behavior is designed to confuse, to provoke, or to subtly dominate the emotional landscape of the relationship. Once you know, you no longer play along. There's a difference between empathy and entanglement. Many men think being kind means staying in emotionally unstable dynamics, but it doesn't. Real strength is in the restraint not to react, in the discipline to walk away from manipulation, in the self-worth to say, I won't dance to music that keeps changing just to test me. Because men who operate in truth aren't drawn to games. They don't need chaos to feel alive. They create their own peace and protect it like a sacred ground. And this awareness doesn't make you bitter. It makes you wise. It doesn't close your heart. It sharpens your vision. You stop trying to be good enough for someone who's using confusion as leverage. You stop auditioning. You start seeing. And once you've seen it, once your eyes are open, there's no going back to the version of you who thought love meant chasing clarity where there was none. Because once you understand the game, you're not angry that it exists. You're just no longer willing to lose yourself in it. And that is the beginning of power. Most men don't realize what they're actually giving away in relationships. They think they're offering love or time or effort, but the deeper reality, what they're really handing over without ever questioning its value, is their attention. And that attention, whether they know it or not, is currency, emotional currency, psychological currency, spiritual currency, because for many women, attention is the oxygen that sustains the dynamic. It's how she measures her worth. It's how she gauges your commitment, and at times, it's how she maintains control. But here's the part no one tells you. While attention may be her currency, you control the market. You see, when a man doesn't understand the weight of his attention, he gives it away like spare change. He texts constantly, he overcompliments, he reacts to every emotional shift she expresses. He becomes hyper, attuned to her moods, not out of care, but out of fear. Fear of loss, fear of disconnection, fear that if he doesn't do enough, she'll withdraw, and that fear makes him emotionally expensive and energetically cheap. That kind of man bleeds value without ever realizing it. But a man who understands the value of his focus, his presence, moves differently. He doesn't flood the dynamic with constant reassurance. He doesn't hand over validation in exchange for scraps of attention. He doesn't offer his gaze, his energy, or his presence just because someone wants it. He offers it because it's earned, because it's respected, because it's reciprocated, and that difference changes everything. When you begin to recognize that your attention is what sets the tone in any relational dynamic, you realize you're no longer just reacting to attraction. You're leading the energy, you're creating the tempo. And when a man leads with discipline, with clarity, and with a sense of internal abundance, it forces a woman to calibrate. If she's used to being chased, now she's observing a man who doesn't chase, he chooses. If she's used to control through withdrawal, now she finds that silence doesn't bring panic, it brings peace. Suddenly, the levers she used to pull no longer work. The buttons don't trigger anything. Why? Because the man has reclaimed his focus, and focus is everything. Where you put your attention, you put your power. If your focus is on her every move, what she meant by that text, why her tone shifted, who she followed on social media, you've already abandoned yourself. You've made her the sun and built your emotional weather system around her rays. That's not love. That's codependency dressed up as devotion. But the man who turns his attention inward, who pours it into his mission, his health, his vision, his brothers, his evolution, that man becomes magnetic. Not because he's trying to be, but because he's no longer orbiting someone else's gravity. He's built his own center of gravity, and she feels it. Women feel when a man's attention is a gift, not a guarantee. When his focus is selective, not scattered. When his presence is powerful, not because it's loud, but because it's disciplined. And here's the paradox. When you stop flooding a woman with unearned attention, she starts to crave the quality of your presence. She stops testing to see if you'll break. She starts calibrating to meet your standard. And if she doesn't, that's the signal, that's the gift of awareness. Because the moment your attention is no longer cheap, the wrong women lose interest. But the right ones rise, they adjust. They meet you on the level of depth you operate from. Men need to realize that they are the gatekeepers of their emotional energy. Just as a woman is taught to protect her body, a man must learn to protect his focus. Not to withhold it as punishment, but to value it as sacred, because you become what you consistently give your attention to. If you give it to chaos, you become anxious. If you give it to peace, you become centered. And if you give it to yourself, your purpose, your path, you become unshakable. When a man knows the weight of his attention and treats it as a resource, not a reflex, he changes not just the dynamic with women, but the entire trajectory of his life. Because, at the end of the day, the one who controls his focus controls his fate. There's something deeply stabilizing about a man who knows what he wants, not just in theory, but with the kind of clarity that cannot be swayed by beauty, seduction, or the emotional chaos of others. And yet, most men haven't taken the time to define what that actually looks like. They wait to be chosen, hoping that chemistry or attraction will reveal the path forward. But when you haven't written your own script, when you haven't determined what role you're looking for in your life, She gets to decide what part she plays, and the danger in that is simple. If you don't direct the movie, she'll improvise her way through it. And chances are, the outcome won't reflect the truth of who you are or what you stand for. See, in relationships, most men hand over authority without realizing it. They fall for her image, her energy, her potential, and in doing so, they abdicate responsibility for the direction of the connection. They become passengers in a vehicle they're supposed to be driving, and that leaves space, too much space, for her to shape the dynamic. She gets to dictate the pace, the tone, even the values if you're not careful. Not because she's trying to take control necessarily, but because nature abhors a vacuum. If your frame is undefined, hers will dominate. But when you operate from a place of internal definition, when you've already clarified what kind of woman you want beside you, what kind of relationship you're building, what principles govern your life, then no matter how alluring she is, she can't play a role that wasn't already written. You won't bend your standards to fit her shape. You won't dilute your mission just to keep her attention. You'll measure her not by how she makes you feel in the moment, but by how well she aligns with the script you've already written. And that's the difference between leading with desire and leading with vision. Most women aren't used to that kind of man. They're used to being the prize, to being chased, accommodated, overpraised. But when they meet a man who's not mesmerized by appearance alone, who sees past the performance and into the pattern, they're faced with a decision. They either elevate to match the clarity of his vision or they disappear. Because the performance doesn't work anymore, she can't shift into what she thinks he wants because he already knows, and that knowing, when it's authentic, burns through pretense like fire through paper. It's not about dominance or control. It's about structure, and structure is freedom. When you've built a life with order, with purpose, with meaning, you no longer need chaos to feel alive. You don't need emotional intensity to validate connection. You understand that the right woman doesn't disrupt your order, she deepens it. She doesn't compete with your mission, she enhances it, and if she doesn't, that's fine, because you're not molding yourself to fit someone else's rhythm. You're moving in harmony with your own. This clarity also protects you from self-deception, from convincing yourself that emotional highs mean it's meant to be, from chasing chemistry at the expense of compatibility. Because when the script is unwritten, every intense connection feels like destiny. But when it's written, when the role is clearly defined, you can distinguish between a woman who fits and a woman who flatters, between someone who brings peace and someone who brings patterns of the past. It's important to say this isn't about perfection, it's about alignment. You're not seeking someone who checks every box on paper. You're seeking someone whose values, presence, and behavior reflect the kind of reality you want to build. That's a standard, not a fantasy. And when you've defined that standard, you no longer entertain inconsistencies just because they come wrapped in beauty. A woman cannot perform her way into the heart of a man who already knows what truth looks like. She can't seduce her way into permanence if her character doesn't align with the structure he's built. That's the kind of man who's no longer impressed by potential. He's anchored in reality. He sees clearly. And because he sees clearly, he chooses powerfully. When you become that kind of man, defined, grounded, unswayed by temporary allure, you stop chasing roles. You start casting them, and only those who are truly ready for the part will remain. There's a peculiar and powerful shift that happens when a man learns the art of emotional detachment, not as a mask, not as a performance, but as a sincere expression of inner wholeness. Most women are familiar with a man who reacts, who pleads, who over-explains himself at the slightest sign of withdrawal, but what happens when she meets a man who doesn't flinch, who doesn't chase, who doesn't seek to be validated or chosen, but instead remains still, centered, and sovereign in his own energy. That kind of man disrupts her entire framework, because masculine detachment is, at its core, her deepest discomfort. This isn't about ignoring a woman. It's about being anchored so firmly in your own identity that you no longer need her emotional feedback to define your value. Detachment, in this sense, is not coldness. It's not apathy, it's composure. It's the ability to witness drama without stepping into it. It's the discipline to maintain silence when silence is needed, and to stay grounded when the storm around you invites chaos. And that kind of stillness, real stillness, can be deeply unsettling to someone who has been conditioned to provoke reactions as a way of establishing control. Many women, whether consciously or not, test a man's emotional presence. They push, they pull, they create tension, not because they're cruel, but because they're seeking a mirror that won't crack under pressure. They want to feel something immovable, something they can trust. But the irony is, when they do meet that kind of man, the one who won't be baited by their moods, who won't overinvest in every emotional ripple, they often don't know what to do with him, because that level of self-possession doesn't just neutralize the test. It ends the entire game. You see, most men give themselves away too easily. The moment she goes cold, he starts questioning himself. The moment she pulls back, he leans in harder. The moment she withdraws affection, he starts offering more of himself in the hope that she'll return what once was. But when a man is detached, not indifferent but sovereign, he does none of that. He doesn't beg for connection. He doesn't try to repair what he didn't break. He lets the space do the talking. He lets the silence become her mirror. And that silence is where the discomfort begins. Because when you're no longer available on demand, when you're not emotionally vending validation just to keep her close, she's left with herself, with her own reflection, with the reality that you're not seeking to be rescued or needed. And in that space, she's forced to ask, who am I when I can't move him? That's not a question every woman is ready to face. But the man who can hold that space without resentment, without trying to manipulate, without trying to punish, he becomes a different kind of force, one that doesn't have to say much to be heard. His silence speaks not of disinterest, but of power. Not of disengagement, but of inner clarity. He's not withholding affection to gain leverage. He's simply refusing to trade his peace for chaos. Now, this doesn't mean he's closed off, quite the opposite. He's capable of great emotional depth, but only where there's reciprocity. He's available to those who are accountable. He gives himself not out of desperation, but out of discernment. And when a man moves like that, it triggers a fundamental shift in the way women relate to him. He's no longer someone to manipulate. He's someone to meet, because here's the truth: real masculine energy doesn't chase validation. It generates value, and when a man stops reacting to emotional volatility, when he stands still in the storm, he creates a kind of gravity, a pull that doesn't rely on effort, but on essence. And that gravity either draws the right woman closer or causes the wrong one to flee, but either way it reveals everything. Detachment isn't about closing your heart. It's about protecting it. It's about recognizing that your energy, your attention, your emotional availability, these are sacred things, not to be thrown at anyone who asks, but to be given to those who earn it. And when a man finally understands that, when he finally lives from that place, he stops playing by the old rules entirely, because once you're no longer afraid to lose her, you become the man she's never been able to reach. And that's when she has to decide, evolve or exit. One of the most costly things a man can do is fall in love with potential, not the kind that lives within himself, the kind he projects onto someone else. And far too often, he does this with women. He sees the fragments of who she could become, the flashes of sweetness, the soft moments between storms, and he clings to those glimpses like promises. He confuses possibility with reality. But the more disciplined a man becomes, the less he's seduced by what might be, and the more he aligns himself with what is. Discipline gives a man eyes to see the truth without distortion. Without it, his emotions do the choosing for him. He's led by desire, by loneliness, by hope, and all of those things can be manipulated. But when he trains himself, when he sharpens his instincts and tempers his reactions, he develops the ability to evaluate rather than fantasize. And that changes everything. Suddenly, he's not chasing a woman based on what he wants her to be. He's assessing who she actually is consistently, over time, in reality. Potential is the perfect hiding place for dysfunction. It's where red flags are ignored in favor of dreams. It's where excuses are made, where patterns are justified, where boundaries get rewritten. But discipline forces you to confront the difference between promise and performance. It keeps you anchored in the uncomfortable, necessary task of discernment, not out of coldness, but out of wisdom. A man who's mastered himself doesn't rush into chaos because it looks exciting. He doesn't entertain women who lack emotional maturity just because they're beautiful. He doesn't stay in situations that drain him simply because he's afraid of being alone. Why? Because he's done the hard work, the internal heavy lifting. He's developed the ability to delay gratification, to pause before reacting, to say no when it's easier to say yes. And in that restraint, he gains vision. With that vision, he can see that a woman's true character is found not in what she says she'll do, but in what she consistently does. Not in how she makes him feel during highs, but in how she behaves during conflict. He's no longer hypnotized by potential because he's grounded in principles. He's not trying to rescue her from herself, or fix her, or mold her into his idea of a partner. He's already shaped himself, and he expects the same in return. This level of discipline creates clarity. You stop wasting time on women who aren't ready. You stop trying to win over someone who doesn't even know how to value your presence. You stop getting entangled with potential partners who are still at war with their own reflection. And this isn't born out of arrogance. It's born out of hard-earned self-respect. It takes discipline to walk away from what looks good but feels wrong, to say no to temporary comfort for the sake of long-term peace, to refuse emotional inconsistency no matter how strong the attraction. But that refusal, that boundary, is the very thing that makes you a man of weight, a man whose time, energy, and heart are not given away lightly. Because here's the truth. A woman may one day become everything you hoped for, but if she's not that woman now, and you choose to build your life around a version of her that only exists in your imagination, then you're not building a future, you're building a fantasy. And fantasies always collapse under the pressure of real life. Discipline gives you the strength to see clearly, to choose women who are ready, not just potentially worthy, to build something real, something rooted, something that can actually grow. And when you operate from that place, you stop being a man who begs to be seen. You become a man who chooses, quietly, powerfully, decisively, because when you've mastered your own impulses, no fantasy can blind you, and no potential can seduce you away from what's real. There's a certain power that begins to emerge when a man stops trying to prove his worth and instead embodies it, not in a loud, boastful way, but in quiet, unshakable certainty. When he's no longer grasping, no longer performing, no longer contorting himself to fit into someone else's expectations, he becomes a force. And in that state, a fascinating thing happens. Women can no longer sit comfortably in ambiguity around him. They're faced with a choice, because when a man embodies value, she must either rise or retreat. This is where most men struggle. They confuse value with visibility. They believe if they're seen enough, kind enough, patient enough, that somehow their worth will be recognized. But value isn't about visibility, it's about alignment. You can be incredibly present in a woman's life and still be invisible to her standards. You can give her everything, your time, your loyalty, your protection. And if she's not ready to meet you there, it won't matter. And this is the painful part. Many men attach their worth to how they're treated instead of realizing that their treatment is often a reflection of what they tolerate, not what they're worth. But when a man chooses to live from a place of value, not demand it, but leave it, he changes the equation. He doesn't have to negotiate for respect. His behavior commands it. He doesn't have to argue for loyalty. His presence filters for it. Because the truth is, women are incredibly perceptive. They can feel when a man is grounded in who he is and what he stands for, and they respond accordingly, not always with praise, not always with affection, but always with truth. Some will be drawn to that kind of man, drawn to the clarity, to the order, to the structure he brings. And they will adjust themselves accordingly. They'll reflect, they'll evolve, they'll rise into alignment with that energy because they sense it demands something better than what they've been offering. But others won't. Some will resist. They'll feel exposed because a man who embodies value doesn't allow space for games, for half-heartedness, for emotional chaos disguised as connection, and for those who thrive on instability, that level of integrity is too much to bear. But that's the point. You don't become a man of value to impress women. You become a man of value to reveal them, to see clearly who's capable of walking beside you and who isn't, and that's not an act of arrogance. It's an act of responsibility, because if you're serious about your path, about your peace, about your legacy, then who you allow into your world matters. Not every woman is qualified to stand next to a man who's built himself from the inside out. And when you embody that truth, when you live it, not just say it, you stop chasing those who don't see it. You see, the man who embodies value doesn't need to convince a woman to stay. He lets her choose. And if she walks away, he doesn't collapse. He doesn't spiral into self-doubt. He lets her go. Not because he didn't care, but because he understands that love built on misalignment isn't love at all. It's dependency, and the man who knows his worth won't settle for that. He would rather be alone in truth than accompanied by someone who cannot meet him in depth. This is the paradox of value. The more you embody it, the less you have to explain it. The more you live in alignment, the fewer battles you fight. Because your life, your choices, your boundaries, they all speak for you. They tell the world and the women who enter it exactly what you stand for. And if she can't stand beside that, she doesn't belong inside it, but the ones who can, they'll rise, not because you force them to, but because something in them awakens when confronted with your standard. That's how you lead, not by control, but by example, not by pressure, but by presence. And once you live from that place, you no longer fear losing people who can't meet you there, because you're no longer available to be diminished. You're no longer open to being reshaped by the insecurity of others. You are the mountain, and she will either climb or walk away.